At 2:09 a.m., a war dog that had survived 3 combat deployments pressed her body over a dying soldier and refused to let anyone touch him. The doctors called for sedation. Security reached for weapons. Every trained professional in that emergency room stood frozen, because not one of them knew how to stop her. Except the quiet nurse in the corner who hadn't spoken a word all night. She was 29 years old. She apologized when she bumped into chairs. She ate lunch alone. And she was the only person in that building who could end this without someone dying. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel don't slow down and they don't repeat themselves. Every single week, there's something new that will make your jaw drop. Hit the like button if you're already hooked in the first 60 seconds, and drop a comment below. Tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to that emergency room. The night shift at Iron Gate Military Medical Center had been quiet until it wasn't. Nurse Lena Vasquez had spent the first 4 hours of her shift doing what she always did, restocking supply carts, double-checking medication logs, and staying out of the way of doctors who had made it clear, in small but consistent ways, that her presence was tolerated rather than valued. She was the newest hire on the floor, 29 years old, no military background on her official file, no impressive residency. She had come to Iron Gate through a civilian nursing placement program, which already made her suspect in the eyes of the staff, most of whom had served or had family who served. She wasn't unwelcome exactly. She was just unnoticed, which she preferred. At 2:09 a.m., the trauma bay doors blew open. The soldier came in on a gurney moving fast, pushed by 2 MPs whose faces were pale under their field caps. He was in rough shape, GSW to the left flank, secondary laceration across the right shoulder, blood pressure dropping, breathing shallow. The kind of patient that made the room contract and focus. What nobody expected was the dog. She came through the doors right behind the gurney. No leash, no handler. Roughly 85 pounds of Belgian Malinois with a military-issue harness still strapped to her body, dried mud on her legs, and a look in her eyes that Lena recognized the instant she saw it. The dog's name, according to the tag on her harness, was Valkyrie. She positioned herself alongside the gurney with the kind of deliberateness that wasn't animal instinct. It was trained behavior. She matched the pace of the MPs. She didn't growl. She didn't snap. She simply moved with the gurney like she was part of the team bringing him in, and when they transferred the soldier from the gurney to the trauma bed, Valkyrie jumped up beside him in one clean motion and stood there. Not attacking. Not panicking. Guarding. Dr. Harlan Briggs, the senior trauma attending on call, took one look at the situation and turned to the MPs. "Get that animal out of here." "Sir, we tried," the taller MP said. "She won't move. She came in with him from the field. We don't know who her handler is." "I don't care who her handler is. This is a sterile trauma environment. Get her out." Valkyrie turned her head slowly toward Briggs when he raised his voice. She didn't growl. She just looked at him. It was enough. Briggs took a half step back, which he immediately seemed to regret, because 2 of the nurses near the wall noticed. Lena noticed too. She was standing at the supply cart near the back of the room, and she had not moved since the dog came through the doors. She was watching Valkyrie the way you watch something you know, not something you're afraid of. "I'm calling security," Briggs said, and picked up the wall phone. Security arrived in under 3 minutes. 2 officers, both of them physically capable, neither of them particularly calm about a combat-trained military dog standing over a trauma patient. The taller one, a man named Dodd, had his hand on his holster before he even cleared the doorway. The other one, Officer Pratt, came in behind him with a catch pole that she clearly hadn't used in a real situation before, because she was holding it wrong. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the patient," Dodd said to the dog, which was either procedure or nerves, and it didn't matter which because Valkyrie's response was to lower her head and let out a single low sound from somewhere deep in her chest that made Pratt stop walking. "She'll attack," Pratt said. "She's not attacking," Lena said. Everyone looked at her. She hadn't planned to speak. The words came out before she could stop them. the same way they always did when she saw something being misread badly enough that someone was going to get hurt. It was a reflex she'd spent years trying to suppress and hadn't quite managed. She's in a protective posture, Lena continued, because now that she'd started, she might as well finish. Her weight is back, not forward. She's not tracking any of you as threats. She's tracking him. She nodded at the soldier on the bed. She's protecting her handler. Briggs turned from the phone. Nurse Vasquez. Nurse Vasquez. I appreciate the input. Now step back and let security do their job. If they rush her, she will attack. Not because she's vicious, because she'll perceive it as a threat to an injured soldier she's been trained to protect. That's not aggression. That's her doing exactly what she was taught to do. And how exactly do you know what a military combat dog has been trained to do? The question hung in the air. Lena held it for a moment. I've worked with them, she said, before nursing. Briggs stared at her with the particular expression of a man who had decided he was done listening. Dodd, Pratt, remove the animal. Lena stepped sideways, putting herself between security and the bed. It wasn't a dramatic move. She didn't plant her feet or cross her arms. She just shifted her position, quietly, so that the path to Valkyrie now included her. She kept her hands at her sides. She kept her voice even. If you rush her from the front with a pole, she's going to see it as a weapon and she's going to act accordingly. Someone will get bitten and someone else will discharge a weapon in a trauma bay next to a critically injured patient. That's the outcome we're looking at. Dodd looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at Lena with something between irritation and the first, faint, reluctant edge of uncertainty. So what do you suggest? Briggs said flatly, which was not an invitation but was at least a pause. Let me try to bring her down. A short silence. One of the nurses near the wall whispered something to another nurse. Lena didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone, the quiet, condescending register of people who have already decided someone is in over their head. You, Briggs said. Yes. You want to approach a military-trained combat dog that 2 security officers are afraid to get within 6 feet of. I want to speak to her. That's different from approaching her. Briggs made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Vasquez, I've seen handlers with years of experience refuse to engage a dog in this state. You're a floor nurse. You've been on this unit for 11 weeks. I'm not going to let you walk in there and get your face torn off because you read something about dog behavior online. It was the kind of dismissal designed to close the conversation. Lena had been on the receiving end of versions of it her entire nursing career. The implication that whatever she knew, she hadn't really earned it, and whatever she'd done before didn't count because it hadn't happened here, in this room, in front of the right people. She had learned to absorb it. She had learned, mostly, to let it go. But Valkyrie was trembling now, a fine, barely visible tremor running through her haunches, and Lena recognized it. The dog had been in alert posture for too long, and she was starting to fatigue, and a fatigued animal in a high-stress environment made decisions faster and thought about them less. Dr. Briggs, Lena said, with respect, you have about 4 minutes before that dog stops holding her position and starts acting on instinct instead of training. At that point, nobody in this room controls what happens next. You can wait for that and see how it goes, or you can let me try something that takes 30 seconds. Another silence. Dodd had slowly lowered his hand from his holster. He was watching Valkyrie the way people watch something they aren't sure they understand, and he was starting to understand that Lena might. 30 seconds, Briggs said, and you stay outside the critical perimeter. Lena was already moving. She didn't approach fast. She came around the left side of the room, wide, giving Valkyrie a clear sight line the whole time. She kept her body angled slightly, not square on. She kept her hands low and open. She didn't make eye contact immediately. She let the dog see her moving, see her posture, register that she wasn't a threat before she asked for any kind of recognition. Valkyrie's head turned as Lena moved, tracking, assessing. Lena stopped about 8 feet out. She didn't say anything. She waited. The dog's ears shifted, back, then forward. The trembling in her haunches slowed. Lena turned her left arm over slowly, palm up, wrist toward the ceiling, so that the inside of her forearm was visible. There was a tattoo there, small, intentional, faded at the edges from years of sun. A specific design, a specific symbol that meant nothing to anyone in that room. Valkyrie went still. Her entire body stopped moving, except for her nose, which worked the air in rapid, focused pulls. Her ears came fully forward. The low tension in her chest, the tension that had been building since she came through the doors, released in one long, quiet exhale. Then she stepped off the trauma bed and sat down directly in front of Lena. The room didn't quite gasp. It was more like a collective intake of breath that nobody finished. Briggs stood with his hand still half raised toward the phone. Dodd had both hands at his sides. The nurses at the wall had stopped whispering. Lena knelt down slowly. "Good girl," she said quietly. "Easy. I've got him." Valkyrie put her head against Lena's shoulder. It was not the behavior of an animal being controlled. It was the behavior of an animal who had been waiting for a very long time to find someone it trusted. In the hallway outside the trauma bay, the next shift was starting to filter in, and word moved fast the way it always did in a hospital at 3 in the morning, in fragments and half-sentences passed between people still putting on their badges. A combat dog. A nurse. The dog sat down. "Did you see it?" "Someone said she used to work with them, but Briggs said she's just a floor nurse." "I don't know." Marcus saw the whole thing through the glass. Inside the trauma bay, Dr. Briggs had recovered enough to redirect his focus to the patient, which was where it should have been the whole time. The soldier, identified by his tags as Staff Sergeant Dale Morrow, 29, assigned to a unit whose designation meant nothing to the civilian staff but made the MPs exchange a look, was alive, but barely. His pressure had stabilized marginally, but his breathing was still labored, and there was something wrong with his abdomen that the initial scan hadn't fully captured. Lena had moved to the corner of the room with Valkyrie sitting at her feet. The dog hadn't left her side. She was watching the team work on Morrow with the focused attention of an animal that understood, in some functional way, that the people around the bed were trying to help. Briggs moved through the initial assessment efficiently, calling out numbers to the team. He was good at this part. Lena had watched him work before, and she had never doubted his clinical ability. It was everything around the clinical work that she found difficult to navigate. "BP's 80/50, the monitoring nurse said, still dropping. "Get me a second IV line, and where are we on the surgical consult?" "Attending's inbound 7 minutes." "We don't have 7 minutes. Stunna." Briggs leaned over the patient, pressing carefully along the lower left quadrant, and Morrow's body reacted even through unconsciousness. A visible flinch, a tightening through the core. "There's something happening here that isn't in the scan. Get me—" "There's internal bleeding in the secondary cavity," Lena said. Everyone looked at her again. She was still in the corner. She hadn't moved toward the bed. But she had been watching Briggs's examination, and she had been watching Morrow's involuntary responses, and she had seen the pattern before. On a different floor, a different kind of room, with different equipment and far less light, and no one to call for a surgical consult. "Excuse me," Briggs said. The way he flinched, the drop in pressure without a corresponding loss from the primary wound, the bruising pattern on his left side. "It's below where you're looking." She hesitated, just for a moment. "It's a delayed bleed. It's been building." Briggs stared at her for a long moment. "Vasquez," he said, with the measured patience of someone holding back something sharper. "You are a floor nurse. You don't have surgical training. You don't have imaging equipment. And you're telling me, from across the room while sitting with a dog, that you have identified internal bleeding that my examination missed?" Put like that, she understood how it sounded. "I'm not saying your examination is wrong," she said. "I'm saying there might be a second injury site." "Based on what? Your experience before nursing that you mentioned once and haven't elaborated on?" She didn't answer that. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was something she hadn't spoken out loud in 6 years. And this room, this moment, didn't feel like the right place to say it. Not yet. Briggs turned back to the patient. "Get the portable ultrasound, and Vasquez, stay where you are." She stayed where she was. The portable ultrasound took 4 minutes to arrive and 3 minutes to set up. And in that 7 minutes, Morrow's blood pressure dropped twice more. When Briggs ran the probe across the lower left quadrant, he found it. A secondary bleed. Below where he'd been looking. Exactly where Lena had indicated. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the screen, and then he looked across the room at Lena, and something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully read. Not an apology. Not quite. Something more complicated than that. "Get surgical up here now," he said to the room. "Tell them we have a delayed abdominal bleed and we're moving." The room shifted into a higher gear. People moved. Equipment moved. Valkyrie lifted her head and tracked the movement without alarm, because Lena's hand was resting lightly on the dog's back, and Lena was calm, and the dog was reading her. It was at this point that the man in the doorway appeared. He wasn't in scrubs. He wasn't in a hospital gown. He was in the kind of civilian clothes that looked specifically chosen to be unremarkable. Dark slacks, plain jacket. But he moved through the doorway with the bearing of a man who had spent decades in environments where the wrong movement got people killed, and that kind of posture doesn't wash out. He was somewhere in his late 50s, gray at the temples, a scar along the left jawline, old enough to be well settled into the skin. He looked at the bed first, at Morrow, and something crossed his face, recognition, and then something heavier underneath it. Then he looked at Valkyrie. Then he looked at Lena. He stopped moving. "Who gave you clearance to be in this room?" Briggs said without looking up from the patient. "Colonel Warren Lyle," the man said. His voice was unhurried. "I need a minute with your nurse." "Colonel or not, this is an active trauma resuscitation. You'll wait outside." "It's all right," Lena said. Briggs did look up at that. "Vasquez?" "I'll stay in the room. I'll stay in the corner." She looked at the man in the doorway. "Whatever you need to say it here." He crossed the room to her. Valkyrie watched him come without moving, which told Lena something. He stopped about 3 feet away and kept his voice low enough that it didn't carry to the rest of the team. "I know who you are," he said. "I'm a nurse," she said. Before that, she met his eyes and didn't say anything. "I've been looking for you for 2 years," he said. "I'm the one who brought Valkyrie to this region. She's been operational with Morrow's team for 14 months. He paused. "She hasn't responded to a single person the way she just responded to you." Lena looked down at Valkyrie, who was sitting between them, watching the colonel with ears slightly forward, but no alarm. "What happened to Morrow?" Lena said. "The real version." "That's what I need to talk to you about." He glanced at Briggs and the surgical team working at the bed. "Not here. Not yet." He looked back at her. "But I need to know you're still in this." "In what?" He reached into his jacket pocket and set something in her hand very quietly. A folded piece of paper, small. Old fold lines, like it had been carried for a while. She looked down at it. She knew what it was before she opened it, because she had seen this paper before. A different copy, years ago, in a different country, on a night she had spent 6 years trying to not think about. It was a mission recall order. Her name was still on it, and someone had marked it with a red stamp in the top right corner that read, "Unresolved." Lena stood very still. Valkyrie pressed her head against Lena's hand. Across the room, one of the surgical team members called out Morrow's pressure again, and the number was wrong. It was dropping again, faster now, and Briggs was calling for something she couldn't hear properly because there was a roaring in her ears that had nothing to do with the trauma bay. The man, Colonel Lyle, was watching her with an expression she recognized. Not sympathy, something harder than that. The look of a person who has carried bad information for a long time and has finally arrived at the place where he has to hand it to someone else. "He's not the only one they tried to silence tonight," the colonel said. Lena folded the paper back along its old lines. She put it in her scrub pocket. She looked at Briggs struggling at the bedside, at the numbers on the monitor going the wrong direction, at the team scrambling for time they might not have, and then she looked at the door, where, through the narrow window of reinforced glass, she could see 2 men in plain clothes standing in the hallway who had not been there 7 minutes ago and who were not looking at anything except this room. The 2 men outside the glass hadn't moved. That was the thing about them that made Lena's chest tighten. Not that they were there, but that they were completely still. People in hospital hallways at 3 in the morning moved. They shifted their weight. They checked phones. They leaned against walls and rubbed their eyes. These 2 stood the way people stood when they had been trained to stand in a fixed observation position, and they were looking at the trauma bay with the focused, patient attention of men who were waiting for something specific to happen. Lena turned away from the glass before they could register that she'd noticed them. "Colonel," she said quietly, "the 2 men outside. Your people?" Lyle didn't look at the window. No. One word. Said without hesitation, which was its own kind of answer. How long do we have? I don't know. I came in through the ambulance bay. I didn't know they were already here. He kept his voice even, but there was something working underneath it. Not panic, nothing that obvious. A controlled urgency. The voice of someone recalculating. This moved faster than I expected. What moved faster? He glanced at Morrow. When he didn't arrive where he was supposed to arrive tonight, certain people would have started looking for him. I assumed we had until morning. I was wrong. Lena absorbed that. She looked at Morrow, who was still on the table, still critical. The surgical team working around him with the focused efficiency of people who understood that minutes were not theoretical right now. Briggs was calling out readings. Someone was pushing a medication Lena couldn't see from this angle. The room smelled like antiseptic and sweat, and the specific tension of a resuscitation that was not going cleanly. Valkyrie was still pressed against Lena's leg. He needs surgery, Lena said. I know. He can't be moved. Not safely. Not for at least... I know that too. Then whatever you're planning, she said, it has to happen here. And it has to happen without anyone noticing those two men noticing us. Lyle looked at her for a moment, and in that look was something she hadn't expected. Something close to relief, actually, underneath all the calculation. Like he'd spent a long time being unsure about her, and had just had that uncertainty resolved. You haven't changed, he said. I have, she said, considerably. What's on the drive? He blinked. What drive? Morrow didn't come in empty. A soldier running from something doesn't survive with just a GSW and hope. He's carrying something. What is it? Lyle reached into his jacket again, the same deliberate, unhurried motion as before, and this time he produced a small, sealed evidence bag. Inside it was a flat black drive, roughly the size of a thumb, with a red stripe along one side. He held it between them, low, below the sightline of anyone looking through the glass. 14 months of documented operations, he said. Procurement records, transfer orders, financial routing, and 3 witness testimonies from soldiers who are no longer alive to give them in person. He paused. This drive is why Morrow's team is dead. Everyone except him. Lena's jaw tightened. And the people outside the glass, she said, are connected to the people whose names are on those records. She looked at the drive. She looked at Morrow. She thought about the mission recall order in her scrub pocket, the red stamp in the corner, her name printed on a document that was supposed to have been destroyed years ago. Why come to me? She asked. You could have gone straight to federal investigators. We tried 2 months ago. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it. The first contact we made was dead inside of 72 hours. The second contact made it 4 days before her car went off a bridge outside of Klamath Falls. He lowered the bag. Whoever is on this drive has reach. We needed someone who wasn't already in the system, someone they weren't watching. And you thought that was me. You've been a civilian nurse for 6 years. Your file from before doesn't exist in any accessible database. You're not in any watch network. He held her gaze. You're invisible, which right now is the most valuable thing anyone can be. She almost laughed. It was a short, dry thing that she didn't let fully form, because this wasn't a moment for it. But there was something absurd in the equation. The same invisibility that had made her 11 weeks at Iron Gate feel small and pointless, and like she'd made a series of terrible decisions, now described as an asset by a man who had driven through the night with a drive full of evidence that people had died to protect. I need you to hold it, Lyle said. Not permanently. Long enough for me to get secure contact established with a federal unit I trust. There's a woman. Inspector Gail Odom, Department of Justice. She's clean. I'm certain of that. But I need 24 hours. You want me to carry evidence in a hospital where the people who want it have already found us. I want you to be the least obvious place it could be. She looked at him steadily. If they search me, they won't search you. Not yet. Right now they're watching. They need to locate the drive before they can move. If they knew where it was, you'd already know. That was logical. It was also the kind of logic that only held until it didn't, and both of them knew that. 24 hours, she said. Maybe less. I'm hoping less. She took the bag. She put it in the same pocket as the recall order, which was already a bizarre pairing that she didn't have time to think about. She kept her hand flat against her thigh and her expression blank, and she looked back at the surgical team working on Morrow, who knew none of this, and she felt the particular cold steadiness that she hadn't felt in 6 years settle somewhere behind her sternum. She didn't welcome it. She didn't resist it, either. Proud. The two men in the hallway were still there 20 minutes later when the surgical attending, Dr. Priya Nair, arrived and took over the trauma bay with the brisk authority of someone who had been pulled from sleep and resented it, but was very good at her job regardless. Briggs gave the handoff in clipped, efficient sentences. Nair absorbed it, asked 2 pointed questions, and began directing the team toward the OR. Morrow was moved at 3:41 a.m. Lena watched him go. Valkyrie watched him go too, and for one tense moment Lena thought the dog might follow the gurney out, but Valkyrie stayed beside her. Either the dog trusted her enough to let go of the immediate crisis, or she had shifted what she was protecting. Lena couldn't be certain which, and it mattered less than what happened next. What happened next was that the taller of the two men in the hallway opened the trauma bay door. He did it without hesitation, without checking with anyone, without the particular performative uncertainty of a person who knows they're in a restricted area and is trying not to seem like it. He just opened the door and walked in, which meant either he had credentials or he didn't care about needing them, and neither option was good. He was broad across the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-40s, a jaw that suggested he'd been in a few conversations that ended with fists. He looked at the room, now mostly cleared, the surgical team having departed with Morrow, just a few nurses finishing breakdown protocol, and Briggs at the workstation finishing his notes, and his eyes moved with the practiced efficiency of a scan. He found Lena in about 4 seconds. Vasquez, he said, reading her badge without introducing himself. You were in this room when the patient came in. It was not a question. I'm a nurse on this unit, she said. Yes. The dog came in with the patient. That's correct. Where's the dog now? Valkyrie was sitting behind Lena's left leg, partially obscured by the equipment cart. The man hadn't seen her yet, or was pretending he hadn't. Lena couldn't tell which. She's here, Lena said. He looked. Valkyrie looked back at him. The dog didn't growl. She also didn't lower her head or soften her posture. She just held eye contact with the man in the way that some dogs did with certain people. Not aggression exactly, but a kind of appraisal that communicated clearly that the appraisal was happening. The man looked at the dog for 1 beat too long. Then he looked back at Lena. The patient, did he say anything when he came in? Coherent or otherwise? He was unconscious on arrival. Did he have anything on him? Personal effects? Any kind of storage device? Anything that came in with him? Lena kept her expression at the particular neutral that nurses wore when dealing with difficult family members, or impatient doctors, or anyone who was asking for something she couldn't give them. It was a practice neutral. She'd had years of practice. Personal effects would have been logged at intake, she said. You'd need to speak with the charge nurse about patient property. I'm speaking with you. I understand that. The answer is the same. Something moved through his face. Not anger. He was too controlled for that, but a recalibration, like a calculation being adjusted. You had some history with the dog, he said. People saw you bring her down. She was agitated. I have some background with working animals. I calmed her. Some background, he said. From where? Before I was a nurse. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have for someone who hasn't told me who they are or why they're asking. He reached into his jacket and produced a credentials wallet. He flipped it open and held it out toward her. The badge inside was Federal, Department of Defense, Inspector's Division, a name she read quickly. Agent Roland Farr. She kept her face neutral. Agent Farr, she said, is there an active investigation I should know about? Because I'm still on shift, and if there's a formal reason you need to speak with me, I'd want my supervisor present. He held her gaze. She held his back. Behind her leg, Valkyrie was a warm, solid pressure, completely still. We can do that, Farr said, if that's what you want. That's what procedure requires. For a formal interview. He put the wallet away. This isn't a formal interview. Then I'm not sure what it is. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, the patient upstairs has a complicated history. People who knew him are going to have questions about what he might have brought with him or said before he went under. I'm going to need to speak with everyone who was in this room tonight." "That's completely reasonable," Lena said. "Have the charge nurse coordinate it with the unit supervisor. I'm sure everyone will cooperate fully." She smiled at him. It was the smile she used on doctors who spoke to her like she wasn't there. Pleasant, professional, completely impenetrable. Farr looked at her for another moment. He was good enough that she couldn't read what was behind it. Then he walked out. She found Lyle in this family consultation room at the end of the East Corridor 20 minutes later. He was standing at the window looking at the parking lot, and he didn't turn around when she came in because he'd heard her footsteps and already knew who it was. "Farr," she said. "Roland Farr, DOD Inspector." Lyle turned then. He identified himself. He showed credentials. Whether they're real is a different question. They're real. He said it with the resignation of someone delivering bad news they'd known was coming. Roland Farr is genuine DOD, which is worse, because it means whoever is on that drive has resources inside federal agencies, inside the oversight structure specifically. He moved away from the window, which is exactly what Morrow's evidence documents. The reach doesn't stop at military command. It goes up. Lena absorbed that. She had spent the walk from the trauma bay constructing a mental architecture of what she was looking at, what was known, what was inferred, what was dangerous, and what Lyle was describing kept expanding the ceiling of it in ways that were not reassuring. "He's going to come back," she said. "Not tonight. He knows I'll have supervision present if he pushes it. But tomorrow, or the day after, when he has something more to work with. Which is why we need Odom contacted before morning. You said 24 hours. I said maybe less. I'm revising." He looked at her steadily. "Can you get Morrow's chart? His real intake information, before anything gets altered." "Altered how?" "If someone with access decides Morrow's records need to reflect something different about his condition or how he arrived, a notation about what he said, what he had on him. I need the original version." Lena stared at him. "You think someone inside this hospital?" "I think Roland Farr didn't come here in the middle of the night for a conversation. He came to assess what was accessible." He paused. "The record system here. Who has admin access?" She thought about it. "Department heads. The administrator on call, IT security. Who's administrator on call tonight?" She already knew the answer before she fully thought it through, because she had seen his name on the on-call board when she'd come on shift, and she had noted it the way you noted things that were useful information without knowing yet why they were useful. "Director's delegate," she said. "A man named Philip Gaunt." Lyle went still. The stillness had a quality to it. Not surprise exactly, but the particular rigidity of someone processing a confirmation they had hoped was wrong. "Philip Gaunt," he repeated. "You know him. He was a contract administrator for the procurement division that Morrow's evidence covers." His voice was flat, controlled. "He left that position 14 months ago and moved into hospital administration. I didn't know he was here. I didn't think to check." The sentence landed in the room and sat there. 14 months ago. The same time Valkyrie had been operational with Morrow's team, the same window in which the events documented on that drive had apparently been occurring. "He can access records from home," Lena said. "Admin delegates have remote access to the system." "Can he alter them?" "With the right permissions, yes." Lyle looked at his watch. It was 4:17 a.m. "How fast can you copy them?" She looked at him. "What I'm about to say doesn't leave this room." "Understood. I know how to export a full patient intake record to a secure format. I have done it before in situations where I thought documentation was going to disappear." She paused. "I'm not supposed to have that knowledge as a civilian floor nurse, but I have it." He nodded once, slowly, with the kind of restraint that acknowledged what she was saying without pressing on it. "How long?" 12 minutes, maybe 15. She looked at the door. "I need to be back at the workstation without it looking like anything other than post-trauma documentation cleanup. Is there anyone on the floor right now who would interfere?" Briggs went to the lounge. "The charge nurse is dealing with a new admission in Bay 4. The two nurses who were in the trauma bay..." She stopped. Briggs had gone to the lounge. She had seen him go. She had watched him walk down the east corridor with the deliberate looseness of a man who had been running on adrenaline and was ready to decompress, and she had thought nothing of it. But the family consultation room where she was standing now was at the end of the east corridor. Briggs would have passed this door. She looked at the door. It was closed. She thought about whether she had heard footsteps in the corridor while she and Lyle were talking. She thought about how long the conversation had been. She thought about whether she had been careful. She was almost certain she had been careful. Almost. "I need to go," she said. She opened the door and stepped into the corridor, keeping her pace easy, professional, the walk of a nurse who was moving between tasks rather than from a room she had no documented reason to be in. The corridor was empty in both directions. She looked left first, toward the lounge, and she could see the lounge door was closed. She looked right. At the far end of the corridor, near the fire door that led to the stairwell, a figure was just disappearing through it. She couldn't see his face, but she could see the white coat. The workstation was empty when she got back to it, and she moved through the documentation system with the focused efficiency of someone who had memorized the architecture of it over 11 weeks of quiet, unnoticed attention. She found Morrow's intake record, initiated the export sequence, and covered it with a routine documentation pool that would look like standard post-trauma paperwork to anyone reviewing system logs without specifically knowing what to look for. 11 minutes. She ejected the export to a secondary format, removed the drive, and was back on her feet by the time the charge nurse came around the corner from Bay 4. "Vasquez?" Nurse Carla Henning looked tired in the way that charge nurses look tired at 4 in the morning. Not exhausted, just worn down by the cumulative weight of a night that had moved fast. "You good? That was a hell of an hour." "I'm fine," Lena said, finishing up the trauma bay documentation. Henning looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone who had been a charge nurse long enough to know when people were fine and when they were saying they were fine. "The dog," Henning said. "She's in the consultation room. I didn't know where else to put her. And animal control is going to need to come in the morning." "I know." "You were something in there, Vasquez." Henning said it in the flat, direct way of someone who didn't distribute compliments casually and therefore meant them when they came. "I don't know what your deal is, but you were something." Lena didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded and looked back at the workstation. "Get some water," Henning said. "You've got 3 hours left on shift." She walked away and Lena stood at the workstation and breathed for a moment and tried to think past the next hour. The drive in her pocket. Morrow's records in a secondary format. A federal agent who had come here in the middle of the night and been careful not to push hard enough to make her defensive. A hospital administrator who had connections to the exact procurement operation Morrow was trying to expose. A figure in a white coat disappearing into a stairwell. And Valkyrie, in the consultation room down the hall, waiting. She picked up the phone at the workstation and called the consultation room's internal extension, because it had one, which nobody used. Lyle picked up on the second ring. "There was someone in the east corridor," she said. "White coat. I don't know how long they were there." A pause. "Did they see you come out of the room?" "I don't know." Another pause, longer. "There's something else," he said. "I just got a message from the contact I was trying to reach, Gail Odom, Inspector DOJ. "And?" His voice shifted, just fractionally, a change in register that she had learned in her previous life to read as a precursor to information that reorganized everything. "She's been suspended," he said, 2 hours ago. Someone filed an internal complaint alleging she was compromised. She's been pulled from all active cases pending review." The corridor was quiet. A fluorescent light somewhere above her was starting to flicker, barely perceptibly, just enough to notice. "The only person I trusted to receive this," Lyle said, "is now unreachable." Lena stood very still. "So we have a drive full of evidence," she said slowly. "No safe federal contact to receive it. An agent in this building who may be connected to the people we're trying to expose, and a hospital administrator with access to Morrow's records who has direct ties to the operation." "Yes." "And someone may have heard part of our conversation." "Possibly." She looked down the corridor toward the consultation room, past it, to the window at the far end, where the parking lot sat under sodium lights, and where, she now noticed, a second vehicle had joined the first two in the far corner of the lot. A dark SUV, engine off, no visible occupants. "We need to move the drive," she said. "Not off the premises. Somewhere else in the building." "Where?" She thought about the hospital's architecture the way she had been quietly, unconsciously mapping it for 11 weeks. Every room she'd worked in, every supply corridor and break room and service, elevator, and basement loading area. The administrative wing was on the second floor. The server room was on the first, adjacent to radiology. The records archive, the physical one, the overflow from before full digitization, was in the basement. "There's a room in the basement," she said. "Evidence-grade storage. It was set up for a legal case 3 years ago and never fully decommissioned. The lock is coded and it's not on the general staff access list. I found it during my first week because I got lost." "You can access it?" "I can get through the door. It won't show my badge in the main system because it runs on a separate circuit." "How do you know that?" "Because when I swiped through it by accident, it didn't log in my access history. I checked." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear him thinking. Not hesitation exactly, but the specific kind of reassessment that happened when someone realized that the person they'd spent years treating as invisible had actually been watching everything. "All right," he said. "The basement. But not yet. Not until the corridor shift changes. We move after 5. "The drive, yes," she said. "But there's something else I need to do first." "What?" She looked toward the lounge where Briggs had gone. "The white coat," she said. "I need to know who it was." She put down the phone. She stood for one moment at the workstation, her hand flat on the desk, the weight of everything she was carrying, the drive, the record, the recall order with her name on it, the 6 years she had spent being nobody, settling into something she could feel in her spine. Then she walked toward the lounge. She pushed the door open. Briggs was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and his phone, and he looked up when she came in, and his expression was the same slightly strained professional tolerance it always was when she appeared unexpectedly. But his white coat was folded over the back of his chair, and the hem of it, she could see from where she stood, was not completely dry. The stairwell at the end of the east corridor sometimes collected water from a pipe fitting that maintenance had been promising to fix for 3 weeks. She looked at his coat. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression she could not, in that moment, read at all. "You're still here," Briggs said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't quite neutral either. It sat somewhere in between, the tone of a man who had expected to be alone and was recalibrating. "Finishing documentation," Lena said. She didn't move from the doorway. "You?" "Coffee." He lifted the cup slightly, as if she might not have seen it. "Nayar's in the OR for at least another 2 hours. I'm on standby." She looked at his coat again. She did it once, briefly, and then she looked back at his face. He didn't look at the coat, which was either because he hadn't noticed her looking or because he had noticed and had decided not to react. And those were 2 very different things. "Long night," she said. "Every night's long." He set the cup down. "You did well in there, Vasquez. With the dog." She waited. "I mean that, so," he said, in the slightly stiff register of a man who didn't give compliments easily and was aware that his previous behavior had made this one awkward to deliver. "I was wrong to dismiss what you said about the secondary bleed. The ultrasound confirmed it." "You found it," she said. "That's what matters." "I found it because you pointed me there." She held the door frame. She was trying to read him, and she was finding it harder than it should have been, which was itself information. Briggs was not a complicated man to read usually. He was direct in his condescension and direct in his competence, and the combination was something she had mapped within her first 2 weeks on the unit. This version of him, careful, slightly hesitant, didn't fit the map. "Get some sleep when you can," she said, and pulled the door closed. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, thinking. The coat could be coincidental. The stairwell leaked. Briggs had been on shift for 9 hours and could have used the stairs for any number of reasons before she had ever arrived at the lounge. She was pattern matching in a state of elevated stress against a man who had just for the first time spoken to her like she was competent, and there was a non-trivial chance that she was wrong. But she had been wrong before, in the other direction. She had trusted the wrong read once, 6 years ago, in a situation with far less pressure than this one, and 3 people had died for it. She had carried that for 6 years like a stone in her chest, and the stone had taught her one thing clearly. When you aren't certain, you don't assume safe. You verify. She went back to the workstation and pulled up the badge access log for the East Corridor stairwell. It was a routine function, the kind of audit nurses used when supply carts went missing or medications came up short on count. Nobody would flag her for running it. The stairwell door had logged 3 badge accesses in the last 2 hours. MP Dodd, at 2:47 a.m., the security officer leaving after the trauma bay situation, an orderly named T. Reyes at 3:58 a.m. She didn't know Reyes. And Dr. H. Briggs at 4:11 a.m. She looked at the timestamp, 4:11 a.m. She had left the family consultation room at approximately 4:14 a.m. She had looked right and seen the white coat figure at the far end of the corridor disappearing through the fire door. The math was 3 minutes. 3 minutes between Briggs badging through the stairwell door and her seeing someone exit through it, which meant he had gone up, not lingered in the stairwell, which meant he hadn't been standing outside the consultation room, which meant he may have had nothing to do with the figure she'd seen at all, and she had walked into the lounge looking for something that wasn't there. Or the badge log was wrong. Or Briggs had badged through and someone else had caught the door behind him, unlogged. She closed the log. At 4:58 a.m., the floor shift change began. It was a 15-minute window of organized noise, outgoing nurses briefing incoming nurses, handoff notes, the particular tired efficiency of people at the end of a long night handing the wheel to people at the beginning of a long day. Lena used it the way she used most institutional transitions. She became part of the background movement, present without being conspicuous, and she moved. She took the service elevator to the basement. Valkyrie came with her. She hadn't planned that. She'd gone back to the consultation room to tell Lyle the timing was right, and Valkyrie had stood up and pressed against her leg with the absolute conviction of an animal who had decided that Lena's location was her location, and trying to leave the dog behind would have cost time and generated noise she didn't want. So the dog came. The basement was quieter than the floors above. It smelled like stored equipment and old paint and the specific staleness of spaces that circulated air mechanically rather than by human traffic. The overhead lights were on a motion sensor circuit that clicked on ahead of her in intervals as she walked. Panels of fluorescent white activating in sequence down the corridor, which felt more ominous than it had any practical reason to be, but was just how hospital basements worked at 5 in the morning. The room she was looking for was at the end of the secondary corridor, past medical records archival storage, past a maintenance workshop, past a defunct pharmacy satellite that had been closed for renovation and hadn't been reopened. It had a standard electronic lock panel, but the panel ran on a circuit that, as she had discovered by accident 11 weeks ago, was not connected to the hospital's main badge logging system. Whoever had set it up had used a different security contractor. Nobody had bothered to integrate it after the legal case it was built for concluded. She entered the 6-digit code she had memorized from the sticker on the back of the panel, visible only if you tilted it out from the wall, which she had done by accident when she'd tripped on a supply cart her first week. The lock disengaged. She pushed the door open. The room was small, roughly 4 meters by 3, with metal shelving along 2 walls, a work table in the center, and a ventilation unit in the corner that hummed at a consistent frequency. The shelves held labeled storage boxes, some of them empty, some of them holding archived documents from the concluded legal case. There was a ceiling-mounted camera in the corner, but it was unpowered. She had checked the cabling on her first visit. The indicator light was dark. Lyle came in behind her and closed the door. He looked around the room with the assessing attention of a man who had spent years evaluating spaces for utility and risk, and after a moment he nodded slightly. "Good," he said. "It won't stay good forever," she said. "Someone will notice the access pattern eventually, if we're in and out." "Once. We come here once." He moved to the work table. "I need to copy the drive." She hadn't expected that. "You have the equipment?" He reached into his jacket and produced a small device. Compact, matte black, the kind of hardware that didn't come from a consumer electronics store. A field duplicator. The kind of thing that took a full copy of a storage device in under 4 minutes without leaving a trace signature on the original. "You came prepared," she said. "I've been carrying that for 3 weeks, waiting for a moment that was controlled enough to use it." He looked at her. "This is as controlled as it's going to get." She gave him the drive. He connected it to the duplicator. The device lit a single amber indicator and began working. Valkyrie had settled under the work table with her head on her paws, which was either instinct or the dog was exhausted, probably both. "While we wait," Lena said, "the mission recall order, the one you gave me." "What about it?" "It says unresolved." "What specifically is unresolved?" He looked at her across the work table. The amber light on the duplicator pulsed evenly. "The official record of Operation Ridgeback," he said, "states that 2 soldiers died in the field due to a handler error during a K9-assisted extraction. Your error, specifically. You were named in the after-action review." "I know what it says. I read it." "What it says is wrong." He said it without drama, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with some. Just flat, factual, 6 years late. "I know, because I was part of the oversight committee that reviewed the incident, and the primary evidence used to blame you was a radio log that had been altered. We didn't know that at the time. We found out 14 months ago from one of the same soldiers whose testimony is on this drive." The ventilation unit hummed. Lena stood very still. "The soldiers who died," she said, "were killed by the same network we're looking at now. They weren't casualties of a botched extraction. They were eliminated because they had started asking questions about procurement irregularities in the unit's supply chain." He held her gaze. "You were blamed because you were there and because you were the easiest person to blame, and because the people who needed the investigation closed had enough access to make the record say what they needed it to say." She had known, in the way that you knew things for years without letting yourself fully know them, that the official version of what happened that night didn't match what she had actually experienced. She had replayed the sequence hundreds of times, the radio comms, the extraction timing, the way the situation had deteriorated too fast, in a direction that hadn't matched the intelligence. She had always thought, had forced herself to believe, that she was rationalizing, that the replay was her mind protecting her from owning what she'd done. She stood in a basement storage room at 5 in the morning, looking at a man who was telling her she hadn't done it. "How many people know this?" she said. "Now, 4. Me, Morrow, the witness who told us, who died 8 months ago, and you." The duplicator's amber light switched to green. "Copy complete," Lyle said. He removed the original drive, put it back in the evidence bag, and slid the bag toward her. He pocketed the duplicate. "The original stays with you. If something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you." "If something happens to me," he repeated patiently, "the copy is with a contact in Portland, not Odom. Someone older. A retired federal prosecutor named Aldrich Vane. He's not in any current system. He agreed to hold it as a contingency." He looked at her. "He doesn't know what's on it, just that it exists, and that if I go offline for more than 48 hours, he should contact the Senate Armed Services Oversight Subcommittee directly, not through staff, directly." She nodded. "Vane's number is in the recall order," he said, "written in the margin, in pencil." She had not noticed that. She had been focused on her name and the red stamp and had not looked at the margins. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the paper. There it was. A 10-digit number, small, light graphite, in the upper right margin above the stamp. She memorized it in 2 passes, the way she'd been trained to memorize things she couldn't afford to write down. "Now," Lyle said, "we need to talk about Morrow." He was out of surgery by 7:20 a.m. Dr. Nair delivered the update to the surgical recovery floor with the clipped efficiency of someone who had been awake for an extended period and was running on professional momentum. The secondary bleed had been addressed. The GSW to the flank had been cleaned and closed. He was stable, intubated, sedated for recovery, and would remain in the ICU for monitoring. He was not available for interviews. Lena received this information at the nursing station on the 3rd floor, where she had been reassigned for the day shift, a standard rotation, nothing unusual, and she absorbed it without changing her expression. Agent Roland Farr had apparently made a formal request to speak with Morrow before surgery was complete, which the surgical team had declined on medical grounds, which was correct and appropriate and had bought time that Lena suspected everyone involved understood was finite. She found the information about Farr's request from Henning, who mentioned it in passing, and she spent 40 minutes thinking about what it meant that he had pushed for access to an unconscious patient in an OR waiting area. At 8:03 a.m., she was restocking the medication cabinet in ICU Bay 2 when Philip Gaunt walked past the open door. She had seen him once before, at a staff briefing in her third week, where he had presented budget information in the tone of a man who found the audience beneath the material. Mid-50s, gray suit, the kind of administrative build that came from years of meetings rather than movement. He had not acknowledged her at the briefing because she had been in the back row, and he had not looked at the back row. He was walking fast, past the ICU bay, toward the recovery wing. She put down the medication tray. She went to the doorway and looked down the corridor. Gaunt was speaking to someone, a nurse at the recovery wing station, and she could not hear the conversation, but she could see the nurse's posture shift from professional welcome to uncertainty, to something approaching discomfort. The nurse picked up the station phone. Gaunt put his hand on the counter in the particular way of a man applying informal pressure without technically doing anything you could report. Lena walked down the corridor. She didn't walk fast. She kept her pace unhurried and purposeful, the walk of a nurse moving between assigned tasks, and she reached the recovery wing station as the nurse on the phone was saying, "I understand, but authorization has to come from the attending." "I am the administrative delegate," Gaunt said. "I have override authority for non-clinical access decisions." "Mr. Gaunt," Lena said. He turned. He looked at her badge the way Farr had looked at it, reading it as a data point, not an introduction. "Vasquez," he said, confirming he knew her name. "Aren't you assigned to ICU Bay 2? "I'm on rotation. Is there something I can help with?" "I'm coordinating patient record access for an external review." "Which external review?" She asked it pleasantly, with the blank professionalism she kept in a separate register for exactly these conversations. "DoD Administrative Audit." "I wasn't notified of an audit." "Notification goes to department heads, not floor nurses." "Of course." She looked at the nurse at the station, a woman named Jess Barrow, who was holding the phone with both hands and looking at Lena with the expression of someone who was grateful for the interruption but wasn't sure what came next. "Jess, did the audit notification come through Dr. Nair's office?" Barrow caught on quickly. I can check. I'd need to verify before I release any records access." "That's correct procedure," Lena said to Gaunt. "I'm sure you understand Dr. Nair is the attending of record for the patient in recovery. Any access requests go through her office." She maintained the pleasant expression. "Shall I page her?" Gaunt looked at her. It was a longer look than the situation technically warranted. The look of a man recalibrating, similar to Farr's recalibration the night before. Except that where Farr had been controlled and unreadable, Gaunt had something harder to conceal. A flicker of something. Irritation edged with something sharper. "That won't be necessary," he said. "I'll coordinate through proper channels." He walked away. Lena watched him go. Behind her, Barrow exhaled. "What was that?" "Administrative overreach," Lena said. "It happens." She looked at Barrow. "If he comes back without documentation from Dr. Nair's office, call the charge nurse before you do anything." Barrow nodded, still holding the phone. Lena went back toward the ICU bay. She was halfway there when her own phone buzzed. The personal one she kept in her scrub pocket, the one very few people had the number for. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words. Basement. 10 minutes. She stopped in the corridor. She looked at the number. She did not recognize it. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under 30 seconds. "Ask Valkyrie." She stood very still. That was not a phrase that meant anything to anyone who hadn't known her unit. It was not a code, exactly. It wasn't something they had drilled or formalized. It was a piece of language from a specific night, from a specific conversation, said by a specific person. She had not thought about it in 6 years. She had not told it to Lyle. She had not told it to anyone. There were 3 people alive who could have sent that text. One of them was Dale Morrow, who was intubated and sedated in the recovery wing. One of them was a man named Declan Price, who the Army's records listed as killed in action in the same operation that had ended her career. And one of them was her. She put her phone in her pocket. She went to the service elevator. The basement corridor was lit in its motion sensor sequence, panels clicking on ahead of her, the same as before. She moved past archival storage, past the maintenance workshop, and when she turned the corner toward the defunct pharmacy satellite, she stopped. There was a man sitting on a supply crate outside the pharmacy door. He was lean, 40-something, maybe older, with the kind of weathered quality that didn't come from age alone. A scar along the left forearm, surgical, clean lines, the kind of scarring that followed a serious repair. He was in civilian clothes. He looked up when she came around the corner, and his face, she knew his face. She had known his face in a different form, 6 years younger, with less gray and more certainty, and she had been told that face was on a casualty report. "Declan," she said. "Lena," said Declan Price. She didn't move. She was working through the architecture of what she was seeing and what it meant and what it changed, and it was changing a significant number of things in rapid succession. "You're dead," she said. "Officially." He stood. He moved carefully, she noticed. The right leg was slightly stiff. Old injury, probably permanent. That was the arrangement. After Ridgeback. I went dark. Whose arrangement? Lyle's. He watched her process that. I contacted him 18 months ago when I found out what had actually happened. He'd already found Morrow. We've been building this for 14 months, he paused. He didn't tell you about me because he wasn't sure you'd come if you knew I was involved. She held that. There was a history between them that she was not going to think about right now because right now was not the time, and Lyle had apparently calculated that she would agree and had withheld the information accordingly, which she would also deal with later. "What are you doing here?" she said. "In this building?" "I came in last night. I've been in the basement since about midnight. You've been down here for 5 hours. I had a book." He said it with the flat mildness of a man who had spent a great deal of time in uncomfortable places waiting for things to happen and had made his peace with it. "I needed to talk to you directly. Lyle doesn't know I'm here. Not yet." "Why not?" "Because what I'm about to tell you is going to change how we use the drive." He looked at her steadily. "Lena, the operation this drive documents, it's not just procurement fraud. It's not just financial corruption." He paused. "There are soldiers currently deployed whose supply chains are being deliberately compromised. Medical equipment that doesn't work. Ammunition that isn't the spec it's supposed to be. It's active. It's ongoing. It is happening right now to units in the field." The basement hummed around them. "How many units?" she said. "At minimum 3, possibly 5. We don't have complete visibility." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet, printed, dense with data. "This is a partial manifest. Morrow pulled it the night his team was hit. It's what they were trying to get back." She took it. She looked at the numbers without being able to fully parse them in the low light, but the column headers were clear enough. Unit designations, supply batch numbers, delivery certifications. And in the rightmost column, a series of codes she didn't recognize immediately, but that had the structure of internal audit flags. "If we route this to federal oversight in the standard way," Price said, "the people who need to see it have time to move. They've done it before. Odom's suspension proves they're already in containment mode. By the time a formal investigation structures itself, the manifests are gone, the units in the field are resupplied with cover documentation, and every name on this list is behind a lawyer. So what do you want to do instead?" "There's a congressional hearing," he said. "Defense Subcommittee on Procurement Oversight. It's scheduled for 9 days from now. Senator Diana Holt is chairing it. She's been trying to get traction on military supply irregularities for 3 years and keeps hitting walls." He looked at her. "If this drive and this manifest reach her office directly, not through DOJ, not through DOD, before anyone on that list knows it's coming, how do you get it to her office without going through a system that's already been compromised?" "I don't." He looked at her. "You do." She looked back at him. "I've been legally dead for 6 years," he said. Lyle is in a building with 2 federal agents who may be working against us. Morrow is in a recovery ward. He held her gaze. You are a civilian nurse with no current military file, no active security flag, and a personal cell phone that hasn't been flagged by any surveillance network because nobody has thought to look at you yet. The corridor light above them flickered once, the motion sensor catching something at the edge of its range, and then held. She looked at the manifest. She looked at Price. She thought about the 3 units in the field whose equipment was being deliberately compromised, and the soldiers using it, and the people in this building who were right now in the middle of trying to make sure none of this ever reached daylight. Senator Holt's office, she said. How? There's a field investigator on her staff. Name is Marcus Trell. He does direct intake for sensitive material, not digital submission, physical, hand-delivered. Price produced a card from his pocket. Small, plain, a handwritten address on one side. He's in Portland. 4-hour drive. I'm on shift for 6 more hours. I know, which is why it can't be you who drives it. He looked at her with an expression she recognized from years ago. The look he used when he was asking her to trust a plan she hadn't fully seen yet. It had been a reliable expression once. She wasn't sure how reliable it was now. Then who? She said. And at that moment, in the particular timing that felt less like coincidence and more like everything converging at once, the service elevator at the end of the basement corridor opened. Lyle stepped out. He looked at Price, he looked at Lena, he looked at Price again, and in his expression there was no surprise, but just the specific controlled resignation of a man who had known a variable was in play and had been hoping he could manage the sequence better than this. I was going to tell her, Lyle said to Price. When? Price said. When it was time. It's time. They looked at each other with the complicated history of 2 people who had built something together under conditions that neither of them had fully disclosed to the other, and Lena was standing between them holding a manifest that documented active harm to soldiers in the field, and the elevator was still open behind Lyle, and none of them had yet heard the footstep at the top of the basement stairs. It was soft. A single footfall, weight transferred carefully, the specific sound of someone who was trying very hard not to make noise. All 3 of them heard it. Valkyrie, who had been lying quietly at Lena's feet, raised her head. Her ears went fully forward. And then the lights went out. Not the motion sensors, not a flicker. The entire basement corridor went dark at once, the way things went dark when a circuit was cut deliberately. And in the absolute black of it, Lena heard the stairwell door at the end of the corridor open wide, and multiple footsteps, and the specific mechanical sound of a weapon being readied that she had not heard in 6 years but recognized instantly. Lena moved before she thought about moving. It was not instinct exactly. Instinct was too clean a word for what happened in the first 2 seconds of a lights-out situation with armed entry coming from a single direction. It was training folded so deep into the body that it operated below the level of decision, and what it said was, wall, low, assess. She went left. Her shoulder found the wall. She dropped below the sightline of the stairwell door and pressed her back against the cold concrete, and she listened. 3 sets of footsteps, maybe 4, moving with the practiced spacing of a team that had done this before, not law enforcement spacing, tighter than that. The spacing of people who expected resistance and were accounting for it. Valkyrie had not made a sound. She was a dark shape at Lena's feet, completely still, operating in exactly the mode she had been built for. Lyle had gone right when the lights cut. Lena had heard him move, heard the slight scuff of his shoe on the concrete floor. Price she had lost entirely. Price had a talent for that, she remembered. For becoming a non-presence in a space, the kind of disappearing that wasn't dramatic and didn't advertise itself. The footsteps from the stairwell slowed. They had expected panic. People who cut power before entry always expected panic. It was the operational logic of the move. Disorientation, noise, movement that gave away position. What they were getting instead was silence, which was not what they'd planned for, and Lena could feel them recalibrating in the hesitation. A flashlight beam swept the corridor. It caught the supply crate where Price had been sitting. Empty. It tracked left along the wall. She pressed herself flat and the beam passed 2 feet above her head. Then she heard it. a sound she recognized and that landed in her chest like cold water. Valkyrie beside her had shifted her weight, a barely there movement, a repositioning of her haunches. The dog was preparing to move. She put her hand on Valkyrie's back, firm, still. The dog held. The flashlight swept right toward where Lyle had gone, and in the reflected light, Lena caught a fraction of a second of the scene. Two men visible in the corridor, tactical vests, no identifying markings. The near one holding the flashlight in a cross-carry with what looked like a compact submachine gun. Behind them, the stairwell door was propped open, and she could see the edge of a third silhouette waiting on the stairs. Not federal agents running a lawful operation. Federal agents running a lawful operation brought lights, they announced. They followed a sequence that created paper. Whatever Roland Farr's credentials said on the front, the team he had sent down here was running something that could not afford paper. She needed to move the drive. That was the operational priority. Not escape, not confrontation. The drive and the manifest were what everything else lived or died on, and they were currently in her scrub pocket, which meant she was the vulnerability in the room. She needed to not be the vulnerability in the room. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the drive, found the folded manifest. She palmed them both, and then she thought about her options in the dark, and they were limited. She could not pass them to Lyle without crossing the corridor. She could not pass them to Price because she didn't know where Price was. She could not leave them somewhere in the room because she had no idea when they would be found. The flashlight was tracking back toward her side of the corridor. She looked at Valkyrie. The dog's harness had a small zippered pouch on the left side, a field carry pouch built into military canine harnesses for exactly the utility that the name suggested. She had noticed it when she'd first been close enough to read the harness details. It was closed with a magnetic clasp. She slid the drive and the manifest into the pouch and pressed the clasp shut. Valkyrie turned her head and looked at Lena in the dark, which she shouldn't have been able to do but did anyway, with the particular attention of an animal who understood that something deliberate had just happened. "Stay close," Lena breathed, the smallest possible sound. The flashlight found her. It found the wall 2 feet to her left first, and she had maybe half a second before it corrected, and she used that half second to stand up from her crouch and step forward into the corridor with her hands at shoulder height, palms forward, because the calculation was simple. If they didn't know she'd heard them come in, she was a confused nurse who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a confused nurse with her hands up was less immediately threatening than a figure pressed against a wall in a tactical crouch. "I work here," she said. Her voice came out steady. "I'm a nurse. I don't know what happened to the lights." The beam hit her face and she squinted against it. 2 seconds of nothing. Then, "Where are the others?" The voice was male, controlled. The voice of someone doing a job rather than losing a situation. "Others?" She kept her hands up, kept her voice at the register of someone genuinely confused. "I came down here alone. I was checking a storage request." She tilted her head at the defunct pharmacy satellite door, which was still slightly ajar from when she and Lyle had been in the evidence room earlier. "What's happening? Why is there no power?" Another 2 seconds. She was buying time, and they probably knew it, and she was doing it anyway because buying time was all she had at this exact moment, and Valkyrie was standing pressed against her right leg where the light didn't fully reach, and somewhere in the dark behind her Lyle and Price were not dead because she hadn't heard anything that would indicate they were dead, and she needed that to remain true. The flashlight lowered slightly, not fully, but enough that she could see the room better in the peripheral spill. The man holding it was approximately her height, heavy across the chest, the tactical vest bearing no insignia. The weapon was an MP5 variant. The man behind him was partially visible, taller, holding a position at the corridor junction. "Come with us," the first man said. "I need to understand what authority." "Now!" She lowered her hands slowly and began walking toward them, and as she walked, she made herself breathe at a normal rate, and she thought about the pouch on Valkyrie's harness, and she thought about Price's card with Marcus Trell's name on it, which she had put in her other pocket, and which these men were going to find when they searched her. And she thought about how long Morrow had been in recovery, and whether he was protected up there, or whether this team had a second element on the upper floors. The man with the flashlight reached for her arm. Valkyrie growled, not the low chest sound from the trauma bay. This was different, Shorter, sharper, the warning register of an animal who had assessed a contact as a threat and was giving exactly one notification before she acted on that assessment. The man stopped. "Call off the dog," he said. "I can't call her off if you're grabbing me." Lena kept her voice level. "She's a military K9. Her threat response is automatic. If you need to detain me, you detain me without physical contact and she stands down. That's how this works." A pause. He was thinking about it. A military K9 with a bite force that could snap bone was a variable that changed the math of a corridor takedown, and she could see him doing the recalculation. "Walk," he said. "In front of me. Stairs." She walked. Valkyrie walked with her, one step behind and right. They were 3 meters from the stairwell door when the corridor lights came back on. All of them, at once, the full fluorescent panels snapping to life in a sequence that went from the far end toward the stairwell, which was the opposite sequence from the motion sensors, which meant someone had physically restored power from the breaker panel, and the breaker panel was in the maintenance workshop she had passed on the way in, where Price had apparently been standing in the dark for the last 4 minutes. The sudden light caught everyone flat-footed. Not Lena, who had been expecting something, but the 2 men in the corridor who had been operating in low-light mode and whose eyes contracted sharply against the shift. The man with the flashlight flinched. His grip on the MP5 didn't waver, but his attention divided between Lena and the source of the light change and the third man on the stairs, who was saying something she couldn't fully hear. It was not much of a window. But Lyle came through the emergency exit at the far end of the corridor at a run. Not a young man's run. Not fast, but direct and targeted. And he hit the second man at the junction before that man had fully reoriented to the light, and the impact was messy and inefficient, and both of them went into the shelving against the wall, which collapsed sideways and created a noise that was enormous in the concrete space. The man in front of Lena turned toward the collision. Lena stepped to the right and pulled the stairwell door shut and threw the manual lock, a bolt that was probably original to the building and which she had noticed on her first visit to this floor because she noticed things like that, because she had spent 6 years telling herself she'd stop doing that and had apparently never actually stopped. The third man on the stairs hit the door from the other side immediately, but the bolt held. The man in the corridor had come back around to Lena, weapon up, and Valkyrie was between them, and the growl had evolved into something that was no longer a warning. "Stand down," the man said to the dog. "Stand down." The phrase was correct. The inflection was correct. He'd had K9 handling training at some point, which was actually worse because it meant he knew what Valkyrie was capable of. It also meant he knew that the command had to come from the handler. He looked at Lena. "Tell her to stand down." Lena looked at the weapon. She looked at the distance. She looked at the fact that Lyle was still grappling with the second man at the far end of the corridor, and that Price had not yet emerged from the maintenance workshop, and that the man on the stairs was still hitting the bolted door at a rate that suggested he was going to get through it eventually. "I need you to put the weapon down first," she said. "That is not how this—" She will not respond to the command while she perceives an active threat. It was true. It was also a negotiating position she was using because it was all she had. "Lower the weapon. She stands down." His jaw tightened. And then Price came out of the maintenance workshop behind him with a fire extinguisher. He hit the man across the shoulders, not the head, which was either restraint or an angle issue, but the effect was sufficient. The man went forward, and the weapon went left, and Valkyrie was on him in the same instant with the controlled, specific bite of a dog that had been trained to incapacitate rather than injure fatally. Left forearm, the way she'd been taught, holding and staying. Price picked up the weapon. He was breathing hard. His right leg was clearly giving him trouble. He looked at Lena with the expression of a man who had done something more physically demanding than he'd planned for and was not going to admit how much it had cost him. "Stairs," she said. "I know." She released the bolt. The door swung open and the third man came through it fast and ran directly into Price, who had the MP5 up, and the third man stopped. "On the floor," Price said. His voice had the particular flatness of someone who had said that sentence in situations where not complying had immediate consequences, and the third man apparently recognized it because he went down. At the far end of the corridor, Lyle had the second man restrained against the wall using a lock that Lena recognized from a combatives manual she had studied 11 years ago. Lyle's lip was cut and he was breathing through his nose in a way that suggested at least one rib was complaining. "We have maybe 6 minutes," Lyle said without releasing the lock, "before someone upstairs notices the power fluctuation or these men don't check in." Lena looked at the 3 men, one on the floor, one with Valkyrie's hold, one against the wall. She looked at Price. She looked at the door to the evidence room, still ajar. "Use the room," she said. "The lock doesn't log. We have time." They were out of the basement in 4 minutes. It was not clean. It was 3 people and a dog moving through a service corridor to the loading dock exit, while Lyle held his ribs with one arm and Price moved with the stiff-legged gait of someone running on will rather than function, and none of it looked like the kind of operation anyone would plan. It looked like what it was: improvised, imperfect, held together by the fact that nobody had stopped moving long enough to fall apart. The loading dock opened onto the hospital's rear service road, which ran between the building and a maintenance yard screened by chain link. It was 9:20 a.m. Gray morning light. A supply truck was idling near the dock, but the driver was inside the building and the cab was empty. Lyle leaned against the building wall and pressed his hand against his side. "That rib is cracked." "At minimum," Lena said. She looked at him in the daylight for the first time, and the cut on his lip was worse than she'd thought, and he was paler than he should have been. We need to get you to Portland," he said. "After that, I go wherever you put me." "I'm not driving to Portland while you're—" "The drive, Lena." She stopped. She knew he was right. She also knew that right and easy were not the same metric. "Price drives," she said. Price looked at his leg and then at her. "I can drive." "Can you drive 4 hours on that leg?" "I can drive 4 hours on this leg." She looked at Valkyrie, who was sitting beside her with the harness pouch closed and Morrow's evidence inside it, and she thought about 3 units in the field with compromised equipment, and she thought about a Senate hearing 9 days out, and she thought about her name on a mission recall order stamped unresolved, and she made the calculation the same way she had always made calculations when the options were all bad, and one of them was slightly less bad than the others. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She went back inside through the loading dock. Abratse. She went back for 2 things. The first was Morrow. He was in ICU Bay 6, still sedated, still intubated, the monitors above his bed drawing their steady green lines. She stood at his bedside for 45 seconds. There was a nurse at the station outside the bay, not Barrow, someone from the day team she didn't know well. And the corridor was quiet. She documented the visit in the handoff notes as a routine vitals cross-check. She noted that his pressure was stable and his O2 sat was holding. Both were true. She looked at his face. Younger than she'd expected when she'd first seen him on the gurney, with the particular fragility of the unconscious, the way sleep stripped out all the performance. And she thought about what he had carried through a field in the dark to get it here. "They didn't get it," she said quietly. "We still have it." She didn't know if that reached anywhere. She said it anyway. The second thing she went back for was Briggs. She found him at the workstation on the 3rd floor, which was where he lived when he wasn't actively managing a patient. And she came up beside him and leaned against the counter and spoke in a voice that didn't carry to the desk 2 stations over. "There are 3 men in the basement evidence room," she said. "They're secured, but not permanently. Someone needs to call hospital security and notify the charge administrator on the secondary circuit, not Gaunt, the backup delegate. Her name is Reeves. She's in the system as the tertiary emergency contact." Briggs turned slowly on his stool and looked at her. "Vasquez. I can't make that call for my number right now, and I can't be in this building when those men are found." She met his eyes directly. Not a plea, just a fact delivered at close range. "You saw the ultrasound last night. You know what I saw before you did. I need you to trust that this is the same thing." He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The same recalculation she'd watched him do before, except that this one had more information attached. And Harlan Briggs was not, underneath the dismissiveness and the professional defensiveness, a man who refused to update when the data changed. That was his only consistent virtue, and she was counting on it. "Those men," he said. "Are they the reason Morrow came in the way he came in?" "Yes." "Is Morrow safe upstairs?" Right now, not indefinitely. She paused. The call to Reeves gets people in motion who will make him safer. That's the sequence. He looked at the workstation. He looked at the phone. If I ask you what's happening, he said, are you going to tell me? When I can, she said. That's the honest answer. He picked up the phone. She left. Price drove. He drove with the seat pushed back to accommodate his leg and both hands on the wheel and the focused, unhurried competence of someone who had logged a great many hours driving in conditions that required more concentration than a state highway in daylight. Lyle was in the back seat. He had stopped pressing his ribs with his hand, which either meant the cracked rib had settled into a bearable position or he had decided that showing pain was costing too much. Valkyrie was in the back with Lyle, her head resting on the seat between them, watching the road through the windshield with an attention that was either instinct or the dog equivalent of having nothing better to do. They were 40 minutes out of Irongate when Lena's personal phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at it. She thought about the text in the basement, ask Valkyrie, and what that had cost in terms of who knew what about her before she'd known they were there. She answered, Vasquez. A woman's voice, clipped, precise, the tone of someone who rationed words. My name is Gail Odom. I've been trying to reach Colonel Lyle for 6 hours. Lena put the phone on speaker without looking at the road. You've been suspended. I've been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review that I have spent the last 4 hours demonstrating was initiated using a forged complaint. A pause. I am calling from a personal device because my work phone has been flagged. I have legal counsel present, and I have a federal magistrate who has agreed to issue an emergency evidence preservation order on the strength of what I have described. Another pause. If what Lyle told me 3 weeks ago is accurate, and if you have what I think you have, I need you to change direction. We're going to Portland. Marcus Trell, Odom said. He's a good man, but Holt's hearing is 9 days out, and a Senate subcommittee intake process, even expedited, has exposure points. I can move in 48 hours with a federal magistrate's order. No subcommittee timeline, no exposure window. Lena looked at Price. He was watching the road. How do I know you're not? You don't, Odom said flatly. I know that. I'm not asking you to trust me based on my word. Lyle trusted me based on 14 months of working parallel to this from the DOJ side, and I can get him on the line in 30 seconds to confirm that. The voice did not soften, but something in it became more direct, less formal. I know what's on that drive. I know what the manifest documents. I know about the units in the field. I have been trying to get to this for 8 months, and I need you to give me the chance to do what I was actually appointed to do. Lena held the phone. She looked out the window at the highway moving under them, the gray morning beginning to thin toward a pale and unconvincing brightness, the kind of day that offered the appearance of clarity without the substance of it. Where? She said. They met Odom at a rest stop 40 miles south of the city. She was exactly what her voice had suggested. A compact woman in her late 40s, suit jacket over a blouse that had been slept in, reading glasses pushed up on her head with the energy of someone who had forgotten they were there. She had a man with her, younger, carrying a legal case, and a second car parked 2 spaces over whose occupants did not get out. Odom looked at Lyle's ribs first. You need a hospital. After, Lyle said. After could be a long time. I've waited longer. She looked at Lena. The look was thorough, the kind of assessment that was professional rather than personal, a reading of capability and reliability rather than anything softer. Lena recognized the type. She had been that type. The drive and the manifest, Odom said. Lena unzipped the harness pouch. She handed Odom the evidence bag and the folded manifest. Odom gave them to the younger man with the legal case, who processed them with the focused efficiency of someone following a specific protocol, photographing each item with a time-stamped device, initialing the evidence bag seal, recording the transfer in a log that he produced from inside the case. Chain of custody. Established, documented, witnessed. The magistrate's order was issued at 8:47 a.m., Odom said. Everything that touches that evidence from this moment is court-protected. She looked at Lyle. Philip Gaunt was taken into federal custody 20 minutes ago. Hospital security, combined with a federal warrant that I pushed through at 6 a.m. on the strength of Lyle's original communication to me, executed on the hospital's administrative wing, while your team was apparently having a considerably less formal morning in the basement. Lyle looked at her, gaunt. He was attempting to access and alter Morrow's intake records remotely when they arrested him. His system log captured the attempt in real time. She allowed herself a small, dry expression that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity. He made it easier than it needed to be. Farr, Lena said. Roland Farr's credentials are real. His authorization for last night's operation is not. He was running a self-directed containment operation using personnel he had cultivated over 3 years. Those men in your basement were not officially deployed. She paused. He's going to be considerably harder to prosecute than Gaunt, because men like Farr keep very careful paper, but the men from the basement are going to have things to say. Because men who were running an unauthorized operation for a supervisor who is now under federal scrutiny tend to make pragmatic decisions about cooperation. Price was leaning against the car. He was listening with the expression of a man who had spent a long time waiting for the right sequence to start and was watching it begin and was not certain yet that it would hold. The units in the field, he said. The supply chains. Emergency notifications went out through the Inspector General's office at 7 a.m., Odom said, based on the partial manifest data Lyle forwarded to me 3 weeks ago. Full remediation will take time, but the flagged batches are being pulled. She looked at him steadily. You've been legally dead for 6 years, Mr. Price. He held her gaze. That's accurate. We're going to need to have a conversation about that, I assumed. It's not going to be a simple conversation. I also assumed that. She looked at all of them, Lyle with his cracked rib, Price with his stiff leg, Lena standing beside a Belgian Malinois, at a highway rest stop in scrubs she had been wearing for 14 hours. And if she found the picture in any way absurd, she kept it entirely to herself. The hearing is in 9 days, she said. I'm going to need testimony from everyone who can give it. That includes Morrow, when he's able. That includes you, Colonel. And Vasquez. She paused. I've read the after-action file from Operation Ridgeback, the version that exists in the official record. Lena didn't say anything. I'd like to read the accurate version, Odom said. When you're ready to give it. The highway moved behind them. A truck passed on the on-ramp, heavy with freight, the air pressure of it washing through the rest stop and then dissipating. Lena looked at the dog. Valkyrie was watching her with the patient, present attention that she had been watching her with since the beginning of this. Through the trauma bay, and the basement, and the dark of the corridor, and the back seat of a car moving south through the morning, steady and constant and without conditions. She thought about her name on a recall order stamped unresolved, and about 6 years of being quiet and small in rooms where people spoke around her, and about 3 dead soldiers whose families had been given a reason that was not the true reason, and about the weight of carrying a wrong answer for so long that you started to mistake it for a true one. I'm ready now, she said. Odom nodded and opened the rear door of the second car, and Lena followed her in. Through the windshield, she could see Price still leaning against the vehicle, his face turned toward the highway, the flat gray sky beginning to break somewhere at the far edge. He had been legally dead for 6 years, and he was standing in a rest stop off a state highway watching the thing he had helped build from the dark start to move into the light, and there was something in his posture that she couldn't quite name but recognized anyway. The young man with the legal case had settled into the driver's seat of Odom's car with a recording device set on the console between the front seats, and Odom was already talking, procedure, order, rights, what this would be used for, in the calm, methodical tone of someone who had conducted a great many of these interviews and understood that the pace of them mattered. Lena's phone buzzed once. She looked at it before she put it face down on her knee. A text from a number she didn't recognize, different from the one in the basement. A number with a Portland area code. Drive arrived. Package secure. Trell. She stared at it. Lyle had sent the duplicate to Portland hours ago, before the rest stop, before Odom, before any of this morning had arranged itself into the shape it was now taking. The copy Price hadn't known about. The contingency inside the contingency, put in motion in a basement at 5 in the morning by a man who had been planning for the version of events where everything went wrong. She looked at the front seat where Lyle was now visible through the glass, leaning against Price's car, having some conversation with Price that she couldn't hear. She thought about what it meant that both paths had arrived at the same place from different directions. She thought about Farr, somewhere in the city, with his careful paper and his 3 men in a basement and his unauthorized containment operation that had just become the most documented version of itself possible. Odom was asking her a question. She pulled her attention back. "When did you first understand that the radio log had been altered?" Odom said. Lena looked at the recording device on the console, the small red light that indicated it was running, the unhurried patience of a woman who had been trying to get to this question for a long time. "I understood it the night it happened," Lena said. "I just didn't have a name for what I was understanding. I thought I was wrong. And now?" She looked out the window. Price and Lyle were still talking. Valkyrie was sitting between the 2 cars, watching Lena through the glass with her ears fully forward. "Now I have a name for it," she said. Odom clicked a pen and wrote something at the top of the yellow legal pad on her knee. The young man at the wheel adjusted the recording device angle. The highway behind them was quiet. "Let's start from the beginning," Odom said. And from the beginning was exactly where Lena started, except that this time the version she told was the true one, and someone was finally writing it down, and the red light on the recording device was running, and outside in the gray morning the sky was breaking open along its far edge in a way that was not dramatic and was not beautiful, but was undeniably, incrementally, becoming light. And somewhere in a Portland office, a man named Trell had logged a package that nobody had known was coming. And somewhere in the hospital, Gaunt's access log was already in federal hands. And Farr, careful, controlled, documented Farr, did not yet know that the drive he'd sent men into a basement to recover had never been the only copy. The interview took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Lena had expected it to feel like excavation, the painful kind, the kind where you remove something that has grown into the surrounding tissue and can't come out clean. What it actually felt like was closer to dictation. She spoke, and Odom listened, and the young man's device recorded, and somewhere in the process of converting 6 years of private knowledge into a documented record, the weight of it changed character. It didn't get lighter exactly. It got external. It became a thing that existed outside of her, that had dimensions and timestamps and corroborating evidence, rather than a thing that lived in her chest and had no form except the shape of what she'd lost. She got 3 things wrong during the interview. She corrected herself each time. Odom noted the corrections without comment, which was the right way to handle it. Not reassuring, not dismissive, just accurate. This was what a good investigator did. Lena had known good investigators before, and Odom was one, and the recognition of that helped more than any soft word would have. When it was done, Odom closed the legal pad. "The after-action review from Ridgeback," she said. "The one that named you. Do you know who authored the alteration to the radio log?" "I have a name," Lena said. "From the manifest." "Don't tell me here." Odom looked at the young man. "We go through the magistrate's channel for that. I want it in a protected filing before it's spoken aloud in a vehicle." She looked back at Lena. "That name is going to matter. It connects the Ridgeback falsification directly to the procurement network, and that connection is what takes this from financial corruption to something considerably more serious. Conspiracy against the United States," Lena said, "among other statutes." Odom put the legal pad in the case. "I want to be careful about what I promise you right now because I've learned that promising people outcomes in cases like this creates a debt that the system doesn't always pay on schedule." She paused. "What I can tell you is that the magistrate's order is in effect. The evidence is protected, the chain of custody is established, and what you've given me today is more than I've had from 14 months of parallel work." She met Lena's eyes directly. "Your name is going to come out of this differently than it went in." It was not a promise. It was a professional statement, carefully bounded. Lena respected it for exactly that. She got out of the car. Price was sitting on the curb when she came out, which was not a dignified posture for a man who had been listed as killed in action, but his leg was hurting and he had stopped pretending otherwise. Lyle was on the phone, pacing a slow circuit around the parking area with his arm pressed against his ribs, his voice too low to hear. Valkyrie went directly to Price when she saw him and pushed her nose against his arm, which he permitted with the studied nonchalance of someone who was not going to admit that it helped. Lena sat on the curb beside him. They sat there for a moment without talking, which had always been something they could do, and was one of the things she had not thought about in 6 years and found, sitting on a rest stop curb in yesterday's scrubs, that she had missed more than she expected. "Odom wants testimony from you," she said. "I know. She told me while you were in the car." He looked at the highway. "I've been legally dead for 6 years. Testifying in a Senate subcommittee proceeding is going to require resolving that situation first." "How long does that take?" "No idea. Lyle says weeks. The legal counsel Odom has seems to think it can be compressed." He shifted his weight slightly, the leg adjusting. "Either way, I'm apparently going to exist again, which is a strange thing to say. How did you manage? 6 years?" He was quiet for a moment. "Badly," he said, "and then less badly, and then it just became how things were." He glanced at her sideways. "You?" She thought about 11 weeks at Irongate, the supply carts, the lunch alone, the doctors who looked through her. "The same," she said. He nodded. Neither of them said anything about the specific ways that the same could mean different things. Some things accumulated enough weight over 6 years that they couldn't be addressed on a rest stop curb in the middle of a federal evidence transfer, and both of them understood that. And the understanding itself was a kind of communication. Lyle finished his call and came to stand in front of them. He looked at the two of them on the curb, and his expression did something complicated that he controlled before it became fully readable. "The hospital," he said. "Gaunt has been in federal custody since 9 this morning. The administrative hold on Morrow's records was blocked before he completed the alteration. The log captured the partial attempt and rolled back the change automatically." "Farr," Lena said. "Farr retained counsel at 10 a.m. His counsel is already talking to Odom's office about the 3 men from the basement, which means Farr knows that the unauthorized operation is the exposure that can't be managed." Lyle sat down on the hood of Price's car, which creaked under the weight in a way that made him wince. That kind of calculation, immediate legal management of the operational risk rather than the underlying crime, is what a man does when he thinks the underlying crime is still manageable. He doesn't know about the duplicate yet. When does he find out? When Trell files the Senate intake documentation. Odom estimates that happens tomorrow morning. He looked at her steadily. The window between now and then is when his legal position shifts from manageable to not. She understood what he was saying. 24 hours in which Farr believed he was still in a recoverable situation, and then the moment when the Senate intake closed the last exit. Whatever deal his counsel was currently constructing would be built on an incomplete picture, which meant it would collapse when the picture completed, which meant Farr would spend tomorrow morning being told that the terms he'd negotiated were built on sand. It was not a clean outcome. It was not a swift one. It was the kind of justice that moved through institutions and procedures and required more patience than most people were built for. But it was the kind that held. Morrow was extubated on the 3rd day. Lena was not at Irongate when it happened. She had been placed on administrative leave pending a review of her conduct during the events of that night, which was standard procedure and which Odom had indicated would be resolved once the federal investigation had formally established the context. She was staying at a motel 20 minutes from the hospital, a functional and featureless place that suited the specific liminal quality of the days she was living, and she received the news from Barrow, who texted her directly in the slightly breathless register of someone reporting something significant through an unofficial channel. "He's awake. Asking for you. Thought you should know." She drove to the hospital. The administrative leave technically prohibited her from the clinical floors, which she navigated by going through Odom's office, who contacted the hospital's legal team, who contacted the administrator on record, not Gaunt, who was in federal custody. But the deputy administrator, a woman named Claire Ibsen, who had been managing the aftermath of the previous week with the grim efficiency of someone handed a situation they hadn't created and were determined to handle correctly. Ibsen issued a visitor pass. It had a specific floor authorization and a 2-hour window, and it was issued without warmth but without obstruction, which was the administrative equivalent of a concession. Morrow was in a single room in the recovery wing. He looked like a man who had been through surgery and significant blood loss and 8 days of sedation, which was exactly what he was. Pale, thinner than he'd looked on the gurney, with an IV still running and a monitoring cuff on his left arm. He turned his head when she came through the door, and his eyes focused on her with the deliberate effort of someone reclaiming clarity 1 degree at a time. "Vasquez," he said. His voice was rough. "Morrow." She pulled the chair from the corner to the bedside and sat. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." He considered that. "Mostly. The secondary bleed almost killed you. The repair is good, but you're going to be careful for a while." "I've been told." He looked at her for a moment. "The dog, Valkyrie." "She's fine. She's with me currently." His expression shifted. Something relaxing in it. A tension releasing that was different from the medical kind, deeper than that. "She found you." "She did." "I didn't know who she was going to find. I just knew she'd find someone worth finding." He was quiet for a moment. 14 months she ran with our team. The handler I had before was killed in the 3rd month. After that, she kind of distributed herself among all of us. But she always knew who was right. Lena thought about Valkyrie pressing her head against her shoulder in the trauma bay, and about the tattoo on her forearm, and about how trust between an animal and a person was built, and how it survived things that human trust often didn't. "The drive," he said, "is in federal custody, evidence preservation order, Senate intake filed this morning." She paused. "It's going where it needs to go." He nodded slowly. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, and something moved through his face that she didn't try to name, because it belonged to him and to the team he had come out of the field without. "My team," he said. "I know. 3 of them. Good people. Not—" He stopped. "Not perfect. Nobody who does what we did is, but good." "I know," she said again. There was nothing else that was accurate. He looked back at her. "The nurse who calmed the dog. That's what they kept telling me when I was coming up out of the sedation. Nurses saying, 'The nurse who calmed the dog.' Like it was your whole identity." "For 11 weeks it was." "Before that?" She told him. "Not everything. Not the interview version, not the formal testimony version. The human version, which was shorter and less procedurally structured and included the parts that the legal record didn't require, but that were true in a different and more basic way." He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had noted in very few people. When she was finished, he said, "They blamed you for Ridgeback." "Yes." "And you let them." It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation, offered with the directness of someone who had spent enough time in situations where the gap between what happened and what was said about it became a kind of wound that couldn't heal because it was never cleaned. "I didn't know how not to," she said. "I thought, if the record says it was my fault, and I can't prove otherwise, then maybe the record is right. Maybe I'm not seeing clearly because I don't want to." She paused. "It's easier to believe you failed than to believe someone engineered your failure, because if it's your fault, you can just decide to be better. But if it's someone else's design, then you have to—" She looked at the window. "You have to be willing to fight something that has more institutional power than you do. And that's a different decision." "You made it, though," he said. "Circumstances made it for me," she said. "Valkyrie came through a door." He smiled slightly at that. It was small and tired and genuine. "She always had better judgment than the people running her," he said. But 12 days after the evidence transfer, the Senate Defense Subcommittee on Procurement Oversight convened for a hearing that had been expedited from its original schedule by a unanimous procedural vote, which in the context of that particular subcommittee was apparently unprecedented. Lena was not in the hearing room. She was in an anteroom adjacent to it, seated at a table with Odom and a DOJ attorney named Sasha Park, and she watched the proceedings on a monitor that had been set up for witnesses waiting to testify. The room smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee and the specific anxiety of a space where people waited for things that mattered. On the monitor, Senator Diana Holt was speaking. She was a woman in her early 60s with gray hair and the unhurried cadence of someone who had learned that urgency and speed were not synonyms, and she had been trying for 3 years to get traction on what she described in language that was measured but not soft, as a systematic exploitation of military procurement structures for private financial gain at the direct operational cost of soldiers in active deployment. The hearing was 4 hours in when Philip Gaunt's counsel submitted a statement to the committee. The statement, as Park explained in an undertone, was a cooperation agreement, Gaunt agreeing to provide testimony about the financial routing structure of the network in exchange for a reduced sentencing consideration. His cooperation was conditional on the committee receiving the full evidentiary package first, which they had, because Odom had delivered it 2 days prior. Gaunt's name, when Holt read it into the record, produced a particular silence in the room that was different from the polite procedural silence of a Senate hearing. It was the silence of people absorbing the fact that someone with administrative-level access to a military medical facility had been running interference for a procurement fraud network from inside the hospital itself, and that he had been caught in the middle of trying to alter a patient's medical record. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then the room began to move again, because that was what rooms did. Roland Farr's situation was more complicated, and Odom had been honest about that from the beginning. Farr had spent his legal window, the 24 hours before the Senate intake closed, constructing a defense built around the claim that his basement operation had been a sanctioned containment of a potential leak in a sensitive ongoing investigation, and that his authority to conduct it had come from a verbal authorization that could not be verified because the person who had given it was now under investigation themselves. It was the kind of defense that sophisticated legal counsel built when the underlying facts were bad, but the procedural record was thin. It was also the kind of defense that collapsed progressively as the people who had been in the basement with him made pragmatic decisions about their own futures. The first of the 3 men cooperated on day 4, the second on day 7. The third, who had the most to lose and therefore the most to gain by waiting longest, cooperated on day 9, which was 2 days before the hearing. The cooperation produced a recorded statement that included a direct reference to Farr's authorization of the operation, described not as sanctioned containment, but in language that matched no legitimate federal protocol. Farr was indicted on the morning of day 11. He was arraigned the afternoon of day 12. He sat in a federal courtroom in a suit that was well-pressed, and a posture that was controlled, and an expression that gave nothing away to anyone who didn't know what to look for. And to people who didn't know what to look for, he looked like a man maintaining his dignity under unfair pressure. Lena was told about the arraignment by Odom afterward. She did not attend. She was not required to and did not want to, not out of indifference but out of a specific understanding that watching someone be formally processed was not the same thing as justice and should not be mistaken for it. Justice was the drive in federal custody. Justice was soldiers in the field being resupplied from verified batches. Justice was a hearing record that documented in official language what had been done and who had done it. Farr in a courtroom was just a man in a room. Her administrative leave ended on day 15 with a letter from Claire Ibsen that was 2 paragraphs long and professionally worded and said, in effect, that the review had found no violations of hospital policy that warranted disciplinary action and that she was welcome to return to her position on the nursing staff. She read the letter twice. She set it on the motel table. She looked at Valkyrie, who was lying on the floor near the door with her head on her paws, watching Lena with the patient, steady attention that she had been watching her with since the beginning. "I don't know if I'm going back," she said. The dog's ears moved. Not a response exactly. An acknowledgement. She thought about Bay 2 and the medication cabinet and the supply carts and the 11 weeks of being someone who apologized when she bumped into chairs. She thought about Briggs, who had picked up the phone when she'd asked him to, and about Barrow, who had texted her about Morrow. She thought about the moments in that building where she had been dismissed and the moments where she had been useful, and how the gap between those 2 things had never actually been about her. It had been about what other people were willing to see. She understood something sitting in that room that she hadn't had language for before. She had spent 6 years making herself small in order to be safe, and the smallness had never actually made her safer. The night everything happened, the thing that mattered wasn't that she stayed in her lane. It was that she knew things nobody else in the room knew, and she used them, and the using of them was the only reason Morrow was alive and the drive was in federal custody, and 3 units in the field were being resupplied from verified batches. The smallness hadn't protected her. It had just made her wait longer to be herself. She picked up her phone and called Odom. "I want to talk about the K9 Medical Integration Program," she said when Odom answered. A pause. "Say more." "Military medical units, K9 teams embedded with forward medical support. The handler-medic gap. When a dog goes into the field with a medical unit and the handler is down, there's nobody who can manage the animal and maintain the medical mission simultaneously. That's what happened with Valkyrie and Morrow's team." She paused. "I can train people to do both. I've done both. There's no formal program for it. There should be." Another pause. "That's a DoD program architecture conversation," Odom said, "which is outside my jurisdiction, but I know people." She paused. "Is this what you want to do?" Lena looked at the dog. "It's what I should have been doing 6 years ago," she said, "before I stopped thinking I had the right to want something." The formal exoneration of Lena Vasquez regarding Operation Ridgeback came through 31 days after the hearing in the form of a DoD Inspector General's finding that the after-action report's radio log had been materially falsified by a named individual, a logistics officer named Bernard Krause, who had died 4 years prior and who was now formally identified as having altered the record at the direction of the same network that Morrow's evidence had documented. The finding was 3 pages long. It was not ceremonial. It did not use the word hero or the word vindication. It was administrative language, precise and dry, the kind of language that moved through bureaucracies without friction because it asked for no emotional response. It said, the record was wrong. Here's the correct record. The finding of handler error is vacated. She read it at the kitchen table of a small rental apartment she had taken in the city, which had a window that faced east and collected the morning light in a way she had found, over the previous 2 weeks, that she liked. Valkyrie was under the table with her head on Lena's foot. She read it twice. Then she set it face down on the table and made coffee. The coffee was bad. She had bought the wrong grind for the machine she had and hadn't gotten around to fixing it. She drank it anyway, standing at the window, watching the morning do what mornings did. She did not feel the way she had thought she would feel. She had imagined, in the version of this moment she had constructed in the dark over many years, that the document would do something dramatic to the internal architecture of what she carried, that the stone in her chest would lift or dissolve or reorganize into something lighter. What actually happened was smaller and more real than that. She felt the weight of it shift, not disappear. Shift. Move into a different configuration, one that didn't pull as hard on the same points. The 3 soldiers who had died were still dead. The 6 years were still spent. Nothing the document said changed the particular physics of what had been lost. But the record now said the true thing instead of the false thing. And that mattered in the way that true things mattered. Not because they erased what was wrong, but because they refused to let the wrong thing stand as the permanent version. She turned away from the window. She had a meeting at 10 a.m. with a DoD program architect named Dr. Yusuf Crane, who Odom had connected her with and who had spent the previous 2 weeks reviewing the gap she had described. Crane had, in his initial email, called the handler-medic integration gap a known problem that had never been addressed due to a combination of budget structure and institutional territory disputes, and had further said that he'd been looking for someone with the specific dual background to anchor a pilot program proposal, and that her name had come up from 4 separate sources before Odom called him. 4 separate sources. She had been invisible for 6 years, and 4 separate sources had named her before the call was even made. She thought about that. She thought about all the times she had stood in rooms and been looked through and had taken that looking through as information about her value, rather than information about the vision of the people looking. She rinsed her mug. She picked up the exoneration document and put it in the folder with the other paperwork she was bringing to the meeting. Morrow was discharged 22 days after surgery. He walked out of Iron Gate on a mild afternoon in a civilian jacket, slightly slower than he'd moved before, his left side still protective but functional. Price was there, legally alive again, the paperwork having moved with the compressed urgency that federal legal counsel could produce when motivated. And Lyle, whose cracked rib had been taped and was healing, and who had spent the intervening weeks coordinating witness preparation with Odom's office from a hotel 2 blocks from the DOJ building. Lena was there too. Valkyrie was there. The dog saw Morrow come through the glass doors, and what happened next was not dramatic and not graceful. She hit him at approximately mid-chest, and he caught her with both arms and went back a half step against the doorframe, and she licked his face with the thorough, indiscriminate enthusiasm of an animal who had been exercising considerable restraint for 22 days and was done. He laughed. It was a rough surprise sound, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected to be doing it, and he pressed his face into the dog's fur and held on, and Lena looked at the sky for a moment because some things were not meant to be watched directly. Afterward, the 4 of them stood in the parking lot in the mild afternoon. "The program proposal," Morrow said. He had been briefed. He had opinions. "You need field testimony, people who've been in the gap." "I know," Lena said. "I'll give it." "You're still recovering?" "I can give testimony sitting down." He looked at her steadily. "Let me do something useful." She looked at him. She thought about a man who had come out of a field carrying evidence that people had died to suppress, who had put it in a dog's harness on a bet that the dog would find the right person. That was its own kind of trust, not in a system, not in a procedure, but in a judgment he couldn't fully verify. "Okay," she said. Lyle was looking at the hospital building. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not to the group, to Lena." "For Price," she said, "for not telling you." He turned from the building. "I made the calculation that you might not come if you knew he was involved. That was possibly accurate, but it was my calculation to make for you, and it shouldn't have been." She held that for a moment. "It was probably accurate," she said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She paused. "But here we are anyway." He nodded once. It was a small acknowledgement of the asymmetry between what he'd done and what she'd done with it, and neither of them dressed it up further than that. Price was looking at Valkyrie, who had settled back at Lena's side after the reunion and was now sitting between her and Morrow with the proprietary ease of an animal who had decided that her responsibility now covered multiple people rather than one. "She's going to be insufferable in a training environment," he said. "She's been the smartest animal in every room she's ever been in, and she knows it." "She'll be perfect," Lena said. He looked at her sidelong. "You're really doing this." "I'm really doing this. A canine medical integration program." He said it with the slightly flat effect of someone testing how the words sounded. "Run by a former Army combat medical canine handler who spent 6 years as a floor nurse being ignored by people who didn't know who they were ignoring." "When you say it like that," she said, "it sounds like a cautionary tale." "It sounds like every story that ever mattered," he said. She looked at him. He was 40-something and legally alive again, and standing in a parking lot with a stiff leg and nothing decided about what came next for him personally, and he had said the true thing the way he had always occasionally said the true thing, which was without announcement and therefore impossible to dismiss. She looked at Valkyrie. The dog looked back at her with the steady, present attention that she had been giving her since the beginning of this. Through a trauma bay and a dark corridor and a rest stop and a motel room and every version of this morning and this afternoon. And there was nothing complicated in it, no calculation, no concealment, just the animal equivalent of being entirely here, which was something that most people managed only in short intervals and which Valkyrie managed apparently without effort. Lena crouched down and put her hand on the dog's face. "Ready?" she said. The question was for the dog, and it was also not only for the dog. Valkyrie's ears went forward. Her tail moved once in the slow, deliberate arc that was different from excitement, older than excitement, more settled. She stood up. She looked at Morrow, at Lyle, at Price, at the hospital behind them, where Briggs was probably at the workstation and Barrow was probably on the floor, and Ibsen was probably managing something difficult with the steady practicality that Lena had come to genuinely respect. She thought about what she had been in that building for 11 weeks, and what she had been in those 11 weeks before that, and in the 6 years before that, and she thought about the document in her folder that said the record was now the true record, and she thought about a room full of young medics and handlers who didn't know yet that the gap existed because no one had thought to close it. She picked up her bag. The Canine Medical Integration Program wouldn't be approved immediately. Nothing was. There would be budget arguments and territorial disputes, and people who had never been in the field telling her what the field required. And she would navigate all of it with the patience she had developed in 11 weeks of eating lunch alone, and the precision she had developed in years that had cost more than patience, and she would not make herself small for any of it. Not anymore. That was the thing about being underestimated for long enough. It clarified things. It stripped away the need for approval from people whose approval cost you something true about yourself. It left you with a very clean understanding of what you actually were and what you were actually for. And it was a hard way to get to that understanding, and she would not recommend it, but she had it now and it was hers and nobody could alter that record. She walked toward the car. Valkyrie walked beside her. Not behind her, not in front of her. Beside her, in the easy, unhurried parallel of two individuals who had found each other in a dark room and had not let go since, and who were now moving in the same direction for reasons that neither of them needed to explain to the other. The afternoon light was ordinary. The parking lot was ordinary. Her shoes on the asphalt made the same small sound they always made, and she walked into it, all of it, the ordinary afternoon and the unfinished work and the people she was responsible to and the things she was going to build from everything she had survived, without apology, without smallness, without the long habit of making herself easier to overlook. Some things break you down to the last true piece of yourself. And what she had found at the bottom of 6 years of being nobody was that the last true piece of her was enough. It had always been enough. She just hadn't been in a room yet where she was allowed to use it.